Here is Alan in Holloway. Thanks, Alan.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Yeah, I was rather disappointed with Carl of Plasto because, as I say, last time we clashed, he seemed to be taking the side of united Europe. Now he seems to be taking the side of a divided Europe. And he also was quoting Winston Churchill, in his favour. Well, I'd like to quote one thing that Churchill said, and that was in his famous radio broadcast on the evening of June the 22nd, 1941, after Hitler launched his assault on the Soviet Union. And he said that the Nazi regime is indistinguishable from the worst features of communism. And I think, he was absolutely right there. If anybody had gone to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they would have found a country where everybody worked, where people had a high standard of living. You wouldn't have seen the concentration camps. The Jews were discriminated against, but they were only 1% of the population. And you would have compared it with the mass unemployment and the grinding poverty that existed at the time in Britain. And you'd have said, well, surely, that society was superior to a liberal democratic society like Britain or America. Well, of course, the truth was that society was totally rotten. And, of course, it caused the most, caused the deaths of 50 million people in Europe. And Carl says that Stalin was a big girl's blouse. Well, I wonder whether, the people in Berlin, when he tried to starve 3 million Berliners into submission by cutting off every essential supply for a year, and when British and American airmen who had previously been going in to bomb Berlin had to fly goods in. And that was really the start of the Cold War, when, the Soviet Union showed their utter ruthlessness by
I think what he was saying, Alan, was that there only was a West Berlin because Stalin allowed it. The Red Army, the Red Army could have occupied all of Berlin.
No, we'd agreed to, and we were allies, and we'd agreed at Yalta that Berlin would be, and indeed the whole of Germany, would be occupied for a time, not indefinitely, but for a time, by, the point was the Soviets we were willing to hand over Germany to a democratic government. Stalin wasn't. He wanted a puppet government, and that was the whole point of these countries.
Well, I think he wanted to make sure that Germany would never again invade and barbarously massacre scores of millions of Soviet citizens.
He'd signed a pact with Hitler that he'd invaded Poland.
Well, we've been across that before.
He signed a pact.
He signed a pact with Hitler only after a pact with Britain and France had been turned down.
No, he signed a pact with France in 1935.
He offered a military alliance with Britain and France, which Britain and France refused.
No, that's not true.
It is true.
He stalled. If you read any of the books, he didn't.
I've read all the books.
He didn't. Anyway, let's talk about what happened after the war, and let's talk about. You said Seamus Milne talked about the freedom of travel, and you also talked about strikes. Why there weren't strikes? Well, there were lots of strikes. Somebody wrote in about the Day of German Unity. Well, before they celebrated the Day of German Unity on October the 3rd, which was the day when the two Germanys united, there was a Day of German Unity on June the 17th. Now, that commemorated a day in East Berlin when, first of all, some construction workers went on strike because they were threatened with a loss of pay if they didn't fulfill their quota. They went on strike on June the 16th. Then, the following day, 40,000 people came onto the streets of East Berlin. The East German government and the occupying Soviet army, and you were always talking about countries occupying other countries, the occupying Soviet army fired on these demonstrators, and probably about 300 were killed. Thousands were put in prison. They even executed Soviet soldiers who refused to fire on the demonstrators. Now, they celebrate that day until Germany became united as the Day of German Unity.
Which year was that you're talking
June
about?
17th, 1953. Look it up.
I will.
And you will find. And I remember, because I went to Berlin in 1989, and I remember that they had the last parade, because of course it was before the Berlin Wall fell. Unfortunately, I was 5 months early. and they had the last parade in West Berlin to celebrate the deaths and of the strikers in Germany.
But it was good that they let you in, given your views about them, of course.
Sorry?
It was good that they let you in, given your views about them.
I was staying in Zeeland.
Ah, I thought you were helping to undermine them.
And I went. But what struck me? But one of the reasons, of course, the East German government. Of course, in that time, I went into East Berlin. To West Berlin rather, just after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And of course, East Germany was one of the few countries that endorsed the Tiananmen Square massacre. Even the Soviet government, even the Soviet Union, didn't endorse the massacre. But I'd gone to Hamburg the year before, in 1988, and I was staying with a girl there, and her mother. I remember having a long conversation with her mother, and her mother was she'd come from the East. And it was, of course, total chaos in the end of the war and so forth. There was millions of people who were being displaced, and she was one of the displaced people, along with her brother. Now, she managed to get to Hamburg, which, if you look on the map, is not far from the East German border. But her brother was trapped on the other side, and they were separated. They were separated for 43 years. She was waiting, because her brother, in 1988, within a few months, would reach his 65th birthday. And at that time, the only people the East Germans would let out were people who were over retirement age, because they bung them over to the West because they couldn't afford to pay their pensions, or the pension bill would be reduced if they allowed them to move to the West.
I think that's a better point. The
point was, she had been separated from her brother for 43 years by this sick regime who wouldn't allow families to be united until the man was too old to work.
A bit like the Palestinians who are kept out of their country.
You object to that.
And you don't give a damn about it.
Well, you don't give a damn about East Germany.
You don't give a damn about it, and everyone knows it. I just wanted to ask you. I know very well. I know very well, because you speak to the whole audience practically every week. Now, Alan, I just wanted to ask you the apparent paradox of the fact that in East Germany today, those very same communists that you have painted so luridly are the most popular political party. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's also, they're not the only popular political party, there's also the extreme right in East Germany.
But I think what I said was they're the most popular political party.
Yeah, along with the extreme right.
Just wondered why you thought that was.
Because as I say, I mean, people always go to extremes when, there's difficulties.
So the capitalism hasn't been quite so much of a success as you perhaps thought it might be. 08717 223344, a spirited exchange, and we can expect another one with Professor Sir Adam Roberts right after this.